What is the meaning of this outrage? This is completely unacceptable. I demand an explanation right now!
Oh joy, let's listen to the Cranky Old Historian babble on about my life.
Hi, this is the Cranky Historian, and thank you for coming back. I think that's kind of a funny way of saying things. I used to say that when I was in the classroom. I used to talk to my students and say, "Good morning, everybody. Good morning, students." Good morning, teacher. And then I'd say, "Thank you for coming back." And they'd sort of stare at me in teenage angst. And one day, a student, really good student, popped up and said, "Why are you thanking us for coming back? I mean, it's not like we had any choice, like we had to come back." And I told him at the time, I just sort of like off the cuff said, you always have a choice. There's always choices. You can come back, you can stay in the hallway, you can go home, you can do anything you want to. You always have choices. Sorry about that. I had a wardrobe malfunction. Getting back to what I was saying, you always have choices. And to me, that is the crux of history. That's what history is all about. When you study history, you're studying the history of choices. It's not really interesting to study something that is a static state, that something that's always the same, something that just never changes. And when you have change, you're going to have conflict. And when you have conflict, you're going to have choices. My wife used to watch a show called Doctor Who on BBC, and it's never really my cup of tea, but I'd look over the top of my computer while she was watching. I always sat there with her while she watched it. And sometimes there was things on there that really struck me. And the 12th Doctor, Capaldi, I think his name was, season 8, episode 8, called Zombies on the Orient Express or something like that. He had a line on there, and I thought, man, this is just a brilliant line. Sometimes you have nothing but bad choices, but you still have to make a choice. Wow, that's life, isn't it? Gee whiz, that's not only history, that's life every day. It's just sometimes you have nothing but bad choices, and sometimes you have more than one. But getting back to the simple things, what history is and what life is you have a continuum. Things are going along a certain line. Things are happening a certain way. And then something happens. There's a conflict. And you have to make a choice. And the choice can be, do I go to war? Do I drop an atomic bomb on somebody? Do I quit my job? Or do I put up the dishes that my wife just told me to put up? It doesn't matter. There's a conflict in there and you have to make a decision. And like the doctor says, sometimes there's nothing but bad choices. And a lot of times in history, we look back and we see, and there's just this long history of nothing but bad choices. Sometimes the choice you have is to do something or do nothing. Simple as that. Matter of fact, doing nothing is almost always one of the choices, and sometimes you have a lot more choices than that. One of the things that springs to mind to me is the Christmas Day crossing of the Delaware River, where Washington confronted British mercenaries at Trenton, New Jersey. These were Hessians. These were the most elite soldiers in the world. Great Britain was at war with multiple countries. And to tell you the truth, ours wasn't even the most important one. They had a lot of choices to make, and the choices they made was to take their major armies, their main armies, and send them over to fight France, where I don't remember where they were fighting at that particular moment in time, but they had multiple conflicts going on around the world. And they needed soldiers. And the German state of Hesse which was in Prussia, had was noted for their soldiers, and they would loan them out for money. They were mercenaries. But they were not mercenaries in the way that we think of as mercenaries. These are not guys who just sign up to go to Rhodesia or something in South Africa. In Africa, these are full armies, and for a certain price, they would go fight for another nation. Technically, they are mercenaries. Effectively, they're just more troops. And these Hessians were well noted for being extremely good. And matter of fact, they had kicked butt against the Americans pretty much everywhere they had been. And they'd gotten quite the reputation for being the brutal soldiers that they were. I think it was at the Battle of Brooklyn, if I remember correctly, that they cut down surrendering American infantry. About 200 of them, if I remember correctly. But at this point in 1776, in mid to late December 1776, this was the year that we celebrate. And matter of fact, this year in 2026, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of this. And it's worth looking back. And everybody thinks, oh, well, 1776, and all of a sudden we have a country. No, we didn't. We had a rebellion. We had an insurrection. This was a civil war. This was not truly a revolutionary war, because we were actually within a single political system fighting to get out of it or get away from it. That's the definition of a civil war, or fighting to change the government, I should say. And the government here, not really to get away from it, but change our style of government. That's a civil war, not really a revolutionary war. And in fact, our Civil War was actually a revolutionary war because the South was trying to actually physically break away. So... And I can see, the Revolutionary War, in a way, we were trying to break away from Great Britain, but we were a British colony, and let's just not go down that rabbit hole like I like to go down to so much, but let's avoid that one just for the moment. And I'll say Washington had his butt kicked, but good, since day one in 1776. 1775 had been a rough year. We had sort of formed our own army and our own navy, Marine Corps and all that, and sort of made a lot of inklings like we're going to get away. And Great Britain was like, no, you're not. And we're like, yeah, we are. And there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of diplomatic talk. 1776 is where the actual combat takes off. You have to understand, Great Britain was the superpower of the world. Period. Undisputed. No one challenged that idea. Great Britain, their army was truly ferocious, I should say. Fearsome. As you might note, I trip over my tongue a lot and invent words that don't really exist except in my mind, which is perfectly okay. You can do that too. There's no laws against that, by the way. There's no rules that say that you can't make up words and just use them. Why not? Anyhow, getting back to Washington. Washington's army had been reduced severely. You have some very good people who are in it, some very good combat troops. And you had quite a few number of people. This was not strictly just farmers and merchants and all that like we like to talk about in our elementary, middle school, and even high school history. Some of these guys were hardened professional combat troops that had been in the French and Indian Wars. And had been frontier fighters and were still frontier fighting. There was a lot of fighting going on within the United States between, settlers, colonists, and British colonists, the Spanish down south, the French up north, and Indian nations that allied with either one of them or were just trying to be left alone and were willing to kill to be left alone. So you had a lot going on. It's a very complex situation. And Great Britain had sent some of its pretty good generals over. And they had done well. They had forced Washington from one place to another. He had not managed to hold any ground. He had lost a lot of people, both in combat and from desertion, which was not unusual. You run a farm, you've got a family to take care of, and you're thinking, well, I can stay here and die, or I can go back home and try to live with myself and, raise my family and all that and be a good British subject, because Washington's not going to win. not very many people thought that we would win this one. When you look at the choices that the Founding Fathers made, it really strikes you. When they signed the Declaration of Independence, they knew full well they were signing their own death warrants. This was something you got hung for. This was not a letter, a stiffly worded letter to the United Nations that everybody sort of laughs about. This was a letter of treason, outright treason. Now, if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's remarkable. It's dissing King George III in very blunt language. I mean, there's no getting around it. It's pretty rough. It's hardcore. And the men who signed it knew what they were doing. And Washington knew himself, too. He had been a British officer in the colonial ranks. He had been a sort of kind of hero of the War of the French and Indian Wars himself. He was blamed for the loss of a fort. It wasn't really his fault. He got stuck out there at a bad position, and rather than a line officer of the British Army taking responsibility, they blamed, let's blame it on the colonial, which is something we do to this day. It's human nature to do things like that. I don't even think Washington thought he could win. I really don't. You look at him, he was prone to depression. He was in pain constantly. These grimaces you see where in these pictures of him are primarily because of his teeth. He didn't have any. He had to wear dentures. They were made of brass and ivory with springs in them to keep him in his mouth. And if he didn't keep his mouth shut, it just gapped open like that. So he like that all the time. He looked stern all the time. He actually was funny. And he liked to tell dirty jokes, but that was just him. He was a military guy. He had a choice to make. He knew, on top of everything else, on top of being outnumbered, being chased from one place to another, winter is coming up, and worst of all, come January 1st, 1777, his army was gone. They had only enlisted for the year of 1776, so he wasn't going to have an army anymore. So not only did he need to do something, he needed to do something spectacular, and he needed to win doing it. So he took a huge gamble, huge. Delaware River, especially in that day and time, was nothing to mess around with. It was a dangerous river. And the plan he came up with was he was going to make a nighttime crossing. And as soon as it got dark, he was going to move his army over, then march on Trenton and catch the Hessian mercenaries, the British auxiliary troops, if you want to call them that, asleep in their beds. And he timed it for Christmas Day. He wanted to arrive on the day after Christmas, right at dawn. Catch them in their sleep, because the Hessians were extremely good. And if you gave them 2 seconds to get their act together, you weren't going to make it. And Washington knew all this. And he talked to his officers, and they knew it all. And what's remarkable is they all kind of like, okay, let's go. And his men that knew the plan also knew what's going to happen. They probably were going to get killed by these Hessians unless they pulled off this plan perfectly. Well, came Christmas Eve, started raining. This is a problem in 18th century warfare because you're fighting with flintlock weapons and you have to put powder in the pan. You ever heard of the expression flash in the pan? That means that you're firing a weapon that didn't actually fire. It's just a little bit of powder that you put in the pan to make it spark. All it did was flash, and it didn't make the big boom that kills people. You can't do that. You can't fire these kind of weapons in the rain. This is a problem. Then there's other problems with getting everybody involved up to the place, get them all rounded up, moved up. This is still a problem to this day, is organization. There's a saying we had when I was in the Army. It said, hurry and then wait. Hurry up and wait. And the reason for this has to do with things like this. It's like, your men are sitting around. You need to have everybody in place. It takes a time to get everybody up and moving. And you're going to move your artillery across. And they didn't have boats. They had to borrow boats from a commercial source up the river and bring them down. And then they weren't expecting the kind of boats they got, and they had to modify them slightly so they could put the artillery on board. Yes, they're bringing artillery across in rowboats. The artillery commander, I will tell you a little side story here because I'm real good at rabbit trailing. This shows the kind of man that Washington was. They were slow in loading. They got started slowly. They had a lot of delays of various sorts. And then probably, I think it was around midnight, a little bit after midnight, they started moving the artillery across. They had already put some infantry on the other side to make sure that anybody who was just out wandering around on a rainy Christmas morning or Christmas night, I should say, was not allowed to keep going. And there were some wondering what all the noise was about, and they were kind of rounded up and held. Most of them were just locals. And yes, there were spies. I'll talk more about that in a second. That's where one of the other choices comes. And along about midnight, 1 o'clock, they started moving the artillery. And they're doing that, and they're getting ready to move all the main officers across. And Washington himself is going to cross over halfway through the loadout and get on the other side. His artillery chief was a Boston bookseller named Henry Knox. And Knox weighed 300 pounds in a day when your average guy weighed about 120. He was huge. And he was incredibly smart. He had never been to any military academy. He had never been a soldier before. But he had studied the science of artillery by sitting in his bookstore reading books about it. And he really did know more about artillery than anybody on the American side. But he was a big guy. And you get the idea the soldiers sort of had fun with that. And Washington walks up to the dock, and Henry's on the boat, and Washington standing there, and there's a lot of soldiers standing around, a lot of other people standing around. He kind of turns around and looks, man, they're freezing cold. It's sleeting. It's nasty. It's miserable. And he looks at them, and he realizes, I have to say something. I have to say something to these guys. And he probably knew it would be repeated. I'm pretty sure he knew it would be repeated. And what do you say? There's your choice. Do you make some brief or extended speech about our cause and about, the times that try men's souls and all this stuff? And no. Washington's a soldier. The people around him are soldiers. They're rough people. So he looks down and sees Henry sitting in the boat and reaches over and kicks him in the butt and says, move your fat ass, Harry, but do it slow or your balls will swamp the boat. That's a true story. And everybody around him, everybody's just like, what? The commander of our army just said that? Isn't the commander of our army supposed to be this dignified gentleman? No, he's Hegseth. He's a soldier. He's seen combat, and he knows what combat's like, and he breaks the mood, and everybody starts laughing. What is the American spirit of infantry is the ability to laugh in the face of outright danger. When you're giggling and laughing, that's American infantry right there. It's brilliant. And it breaks the mood. And everybody's like, that's funny as hell. And what did he say? What did he say? And they're repeating it and all that and going back. And it's like, dang, this is funny. If he's joking, this can't be all that serious. And come on, let's go. It really lightened the mood. He crossed the river and gets on up. In the meantime, the Hessian general, and his name escapes my mind right at the moment. I'm sure Pett will put up a snide comment and his name here in a minute. He was playing cards. It was Christmas night. Everybody was just relaxed. They were drinking, not heavily. They weren't drunk. They were just, drinking as usual, a little bit, playing cards. And a spy who had seen Washington crossing came up and had a note for him. And the note, they wouldn't let him in to see the general. Wouldn't have helped because he didn't speak English. He only spoke German. And gave him the note. His aide gave him the note. And he kind of looked at it. It was in English. And he made a choice at that point. If in the evening somebody comes up that's clearly a spy or something like that and hands you a note, I would personally have had somebody say, hey, what's the translation of this? What does it say? But no, he just kind of looks at it and shoves it in his pocket. Forgets about it. Keeps on playing cards. Long story short, Washington moves in. It's long after dawn by the time he's moving in. But God is on the side of our infantry because the Hessians were taking a rare time not to get up at the crack of dawn and get ready for the day. They were just sort of lolling about when all of a sudden we showed up. They did start assembling, but by that time we were in position. Some shots were exchanged. The weather improved by then. There was some hand-to-hand combat, but by and large, the Hessians knew the Americans had gotten the drop on them, so they surrendered. And the Hessian general was killed during the exchange of fire, and in his pocket was found that note. He had made a choice. He had made a bad choice, and it bit him in the end. And that's what I mean by choices. You came to a conflict point, and what choice did you make? Now, what can we learn from that? Well, if you're commanding an army and you're in enemy territory and somebody brings you a note, you might want to be able to read that note or get somebody to tell you what it says. You learn a lesson from that. And the other lesson is that Americans will cross a frozen river on Christmas Day in order to kill you in your sleep because we've done it before. There's another point. There's a lot of other points we can talk about that have to do directly with that. And I didn't want to make a long, drawn-out video today, which I'm doing again because that's what I'm best at. But I wanted to talk about when you understand history, when you're trying to understand history, what you're trying to do truly is understand the choices that people made. Why did this person do this? Why did this person do that? Would I have done the same thing in the same situation? I put myself in those shoes a lot, especially when I'm reading about or researching Civil War history, because I had so many relatives in that war. It's like, would I have done what they did? Would I have taken up arms against what used to be my country in order to protect my home and my family? Would I have done that? And the answer to me is absolutely I would have done that. Without a second thought. I love my country. That's a given. I have some problems with this government, but not enough to do anything more than grumble about, like pretty much everybody. But my family comes first. God comes first. Then family. Then everything else. And I would do whatever I would to defend my family. And I think most people are like that. The most people. I think what bothers everybody is when you see these situations lately where people have made choices where, you've got families and here you're out doing something nonsensical and you're threatening your own family to do some nonsense. Well, they decided their choices they made was they came to that crisis point, that point where they had to make a decision. And they said, well, whatever this is that I've decided to do is more important than my family. Or maybe they didn't even think that much. Here on our side, the conservative side, we talk a lot about the left and, how crazy they seem to us and the crazy decisions and people who have died recently in trying to interfere with federal operations. And to us, this doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing this? You don't hold court on the side of the road. You go to court. If you don't like a law, you go to Congress. But there's reasons that they're doing this, and we can talk more about that. And they may or may not be in on the higher aspects of those. They may not know everything. It's like that's one thing as a lower enlisted guy, it's like a lot of times, why are we doing this? I don't know. We're just slogging along some road in some godforsaken country because why? I have no idea. I'm not in the decision-making body. I have no idea, but we're here. So, okay. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. And when you're studying history, or when you're just trying to go through life, how do you do it? Do you just sort of react to whatever's there? That's when you end up in vest cam videos from cops a lot. Well, I wanted this thing, so I just took it. Well, you can't do that. Well, I have a bill I can't pay, so what do? Ignore it or call them up and say, hey, I just can't afford it today. Well, you call them up and, they may be nasty, they may be pleasant, but you take proactive actions. And sometimes those proactive actions work, sometimes they don't. But you almost always doing something rather than just going the status is the better choice when it comes to conflict. Your wife is upset at you. Do I ignore her or do I go to her and say, hey, are you upset? It's always better to say that. If she says she's fine and she's a Southern woman, that means that something is really wrong. And you might as well just go ahead and start apologizing because, yeah, that's just the best choice. And buy her a new car or something. But seriously, getting back to the subject, choices made within crisis situations, this is what makes history. And when you're reading history, this is what it's all about, is choices. And then you start understanding historical events as being very people-y. These are not events from long, long ago. These are not, what I'm trying to say is we're not all that separated from anything that happened in history. These are people that have the same basic desires we have, the same basic outlooks. They get tired, they get grumpy, they want to have peace, they want this, they want that. And yet they're caught up in circumstances beyond their control. And this is what makes them interesting. And this is what made it so interesting for me as a historian. One of the things I got really, really interested in, I worked on a project. I was with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the Currahees. I was with them for a while. And when I came out, I joined the Historical Association for them, the Veterans Association. And eventually I was on the historical committee for a while. And one of the things I helped work on was a project where we were matching up West Point cadets doing oral histories with 506 veterans from World War II. And the one thing I found most interesting about listening to those tapes is what happened when they came home. How do you come home from these? And you're getting out of the Army and you're coming back. And when I got out of the Army, I sort of kind of had to, or I could have stayed in. There was some issues going on. But I made the choice to come home and get out. And I was going to go do something else. And I remember getting out and putting my bags down at my parents' driveway. I had not let them know I was on my way home because I felt bad about a lot of stuff that had happened. And set my bags down, stood in the driveway, looked at their house, said, well, what do I do now? And it's amazing how many of these guys did that. Is they had some of them had a very hard time letting go of the war. Very hard time. And I understand that completely. And others just seemed like, okay, well, I was able to put it in the past. I had an uncle, technically a cousin, but we called him Uncle Bynum. And he had been an artilleryman in the South Pacific. And my mother bugged me after I started writing books. I said, you need to go talk to Uncle Bynum. He never did tell us what happened to him. He just kind of came home and wouldn't talk about it. Okay, I'll talk to him. So I went and talked to Uncle Bynum, and it turns out that he decided he was just going to put it all behind him. He made the decision he was going to come home and not let the war destroy him, because he had known other people who came home and crawled inside an alcohol bottle and never left, or started fighting, or just let it consume them. And he told me, he said, I never talked about it because if I talked about it very much, I'd probably never shut up. And if I never shut up, I'd probably want to crawl inside a bottle and never come out again. So I just put my head down and just kept going. That was his decision. That was his choice. And he was a really good man, very quiet man, but very good man to the end, to the very end. And how you come back from things, the choices you make. Well, what can we learn from this? What's the analysis? That's the stories. That's the facts and the stories. And as I said in my first video, the third part is analysis. What's the takeaway from this? The choices you make define who you are. Period. One way or another, negatively or positively. Especially the ones you make without knowing all of the facts. I heard something upsetting this morning. Somebody had supposedly said something about me and from the past, from a job I previously had. And it's like, yeah, it kind of irritated me and it kind of upset me and really upset the person who it was said to. And I'm like, well, what am I going to do about this? Well, quite frankly, I'm going to do nothing. What do I care what other people think of me? And I talked to my wife about it, and she said, what are you going to do about it? And I was like, well, it rose to the level where, I could sue them for what happened, and I'd probably take their houses and their money away. But what does that make me? I'm a Christian. It talks about Christians not suing people in Scripture, but suing other Christians. But at the same time, that's a commandment from God, but I don't want to sue anybody for anything. I don't want anybody to lose their house because they said something stupid. Even if it had mean intentions, which it did. Even if it was to cause harm, which it did. What I rely on is that God will keep his vengeance and I will keep my peace. And that's the choice that I'm going to make. You choose as you will what you do in any situation. But for me and my house, we choose the Lord, and we choose the way of righteousness, and we choose the way of peace. And peace of God is what I leave with you today, friends. Thank you for being there and listening to me just babble on about an idea or two. And I hope you have a really wonderful day. And I hope to see you here again soon at the Cranky Old Historian.